Hello everyone and welcome back to another IELTS speaking video. So today we're going to focus on the area of expressions. Now, every single language has its own expressions, and just to let you know, this word is interchangeable with words like idioms or even sayings. It's usually a fixed phrase with a particular meaning that doesn't always have to be literal in its words, okay? Now, one thing I guess you could compare this with is the actual use of phrasal verbs that we covered in a video on register. A lot of the time, phrasal verbs can be literal or not literal, but I did say that it is an area that's commonly used in spoken English, and if you can use some phrasal verbs on the speaking exam, that it would look impressive to the examiner. So, because of this, I sometimes get questions about expressions, so people ask me if they should use expressions on the exam. And I would say yes, but be careful with the type of expressions that you're using, because some might seem a little bit unnatural to use. So for example, if you go onto the internet and you just put English idioms or expressions into the search bar, you're going to get a whole list of hundreds of idioms, and I don't recommend just learning any one of them or just, a specific group of them at random, because these idioms may be very uncommon in English. So because of this, what I have done is put together a list of expressions that you can use in a particular situation in the next exercise if you're working on my website. But for this video, we're going to go into how expressions work and how a couple of them really can help you with describing quite specific things. So without any further ado, I will share my screen with you now. Okay, so before we get into the idiom on the screen, I'd just like to turn your attention to what I've written over here. So this is a reminder of what I put right at the beginning of the course in the introduction, and that's going back to the idea of keeping a lexical notebook. Now, of course, it is always a good idea to keep these four things in mind when you are recording new vocabulary and phrases. So before we get into the idiom, I'm going to single out this word. Now, if you watched the last video on pronunciation, I talked about the importance of stress and intonation, because English is a stress-timed language, and if you do want to sound more natural, then paying attention to stress becomes very important. So this word can be a little hard to pronounce. But before we get there, let's go through its meaning, okay? Not the meaning of the whole idiom, but just this word right here. So this basically means something that is worn to hide your identity, okay? So, and I'll give you the pronunciation here too, because I have to use the word. Batman, for example, wears a disguise, okay? So he wears a mask. So you don't know his true identity. So you don't know that it's Bruce Wayne in this example. So that's the meaning of the word. I'll come back to pronunciation, but as we can see next to the word, it is a noun, okay? So you wear a disguise, so disguise would be a noun. And then I'll give you the pronunciation one more time, and make sure that you're stressing the second syllable out of these two syllables. So one more time, disguise, okay? And it makes an I sound, not you almost ignore the U completely. And as we said in the previous video, English is not a very phonetic language. Now, when we covered collocation, we mainly spoke about prepositions. To remind you, I do have a collocation video on my writing course. But collocation doesn't always have to be other single words that go with or match with a particular word. It can even be a full idiom, like this one. Okay. And as I've already said, there are idioms that are very uncommon if you just go on the internet and just start learning what, the first ones that you see. But this that I've given here is not only an example collocation, if you like, that uses disguise, but this whole idiom is actually quite common. And if you throw in an idiom like this in your IELTS speaking exam, this can look very impressive to the examiner, and it's got a very particular meaning. But I am going to test you on it a little bit, just like I've done in a previous video. So again, when you learn the meaning, form, pronunciation, and collocation for a single word, you can also extend that to a whole phrase, or in this case, an expression. So the form stays the same. A blessing in disguise is still a noun, okay? The pronunciation, I've just said it. I'll say it one more time. A blessing in disguise. And a blessing is almost taken from religious language. It's like good fortune presented to you, a blessing. And we've already covered the collocation. So I'm going to leave it to you now. I would like you to pause the video in just a moment, and I'd like you to think what this idiom means just by looking at the words. It's not always so obvious, so be careful, but maybe you're able to tell. So is it when you take something bad from a good situation? Is it when you take something good from a bad situation? Or is it to miss an opportunity? So when we come back, I'm going to have the correct answer on the screen. So when you're ready, take a few moments and pause the video now. Okay, so how did you do? Did you get the correct answer? You can see that I tried to make it a little bit challenging for you because these first two definitions are kind of reversed. And then if you read through the idiom, I suppose literally, you might think that the blessing was hidden. So you might have missed an opportunity. But this actually isn't what it means. It's not a negative idiom. It has a positive meaning. And it is when you take something good from a seemingly bad situation. And I have an example that I can give you from my own life. And it was about 13 years ago that this happened. Maybe you remember it if you're old enough. There was an eruption, a massive volcanic eruption in Iceland, and it affected international travel. Now, at this time, I was in Malta. I used to teach out in Malta, but I was living in the UK at the time, and I was there on holiday. But I wasn't just on holiday, I was actually trying to get another job at my old company. Now, I'd only booked to be there for 7 days, but unfortunately, in that 7 days, the manager who was going to interview me was not there. He was actually on holiday, so I couldn't meet with him while I was there. So on the 6th or 7th day, this is when the volcano erupted, and it meant that we couldn't fly back to the UK, and we had to spend an extra week in Malta. Now, this turned out to be a blessing in disguise because the manager came back from his domestic holiday. I managed to have an interview with him, and then I got the job. So what was seemingly a bad situation, the volcano erupting and cancelling flights, was actually, for me working there, a blessing in disguise. And you can see that this has a very specific meaning. There's not really many other phrases that you can use to describe this kind of event. So if you have a story like that to tell the examiner on your speaking exam, this is definitely a good one to use. And you can see how idioms can really make your spoken English much more specific as well. Okay, so as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, if you're working on my website, the next few exercises are going to provide some more expressions that you can use. And they also include some phrasal verbs as well. Now, these expressions will be topic specific because in the final interactive task today, we're going back to IELTS speaking part 3, and I would love to see some of these expressions and phrasal verbs used on that final task. So, as always, I look forward to hearing those tasks, and I look forward to seeing you all in another video very soon.